On this episode of Newt's World, there is so much going on with the presidential race right now. And I'm laughing because, there is so much going on. I wanted to talk with somebody who follows the ups and downs of the race and reports on them for Politico. So I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Jonathan Martin. He is the Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico, where he writes a column on the inside conversation and big picture trends shaping politics. Prior to starting his column in 2022, he was the national political correspondent for the New York Times, serving as the publication's top political reporter for nearly a decade. And I can tell you personally, every time I see his stuff, I read it. He is one of the 3 or 4 smartest people analyzing American politics. He does so with a sense of really trying to get at the facts and not just being sort of a propagandist. He's also the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thanks for having me back, Speaker. You were kind enough to have us on when the book came out in 22 and sold us a few copies. So I'm grateful for having us then and having me now.
Well, listen, I'm always delighted to help budding authors get as many sales as they can get.
You know something from selling books. Absolutely.
Yeah. I have to start. Callista and I, as you know, and we were talking, were in Rome during the debate. So we literally got up at 3 a.m. because we just had this instinct that this debate would be important. Now, I will tell you in advance, I thought if Trump got by with no more than 1 or 2 minor mistakes, and Biden had 3 or 4 of the kind of gaffes we've seen, that would be a good night for us. It would never have occurred to me to have Biden as collapsing as he was and to watch it for 90 minutes. I was really glad that we got up and watched it because I think you had to see it live to really appreciate it. But what was your reaction watching it that night?
It was the same in real time. You're kind of looking around the room to see, are other people seeing what you're seeing? And is this going as poorly for the president as it seemed? And obviously it was. It was almost surreal in the sense that he was unable to drive a message or in some answer even complete a thought. So it was obviously a disaster for him politically. I can tell you that within the first 20 minutes, I was getting text messages and emails from elected Democratic officials already talking about his inability to be the nominee, saying in blunt terms, we have to get him out of the race. So this movement to drop Biden, Speaker, was underway within minutes of that debate taking place.
From your perspective, as you've watched sort of this roller coaster, my sense was that people on the left were so shaken, and it was so sort of unimaginable that you don't get in the opening round the kind of response. It takes 4 or 5 days to really begin to build. And I think one of the differences between the Trump operation, which has been engaged in sort of permanent warfare since June of 2015, the Trump people would have, the following morning, already been on offense and trying to figure out what to do and reaching out. And the Biden people were sort of lackadaisical and I think couldn't quite imagine it had happened. Does that fit what you saw?
Well, I think the Biden folks thought it was a bad one-day story that they could fix the next day if Biden was energetic at his rally in North Carolina. And I think that's where the breakdown occurred, that it wasn't just a one-day story, and you couldn't do triage by having a good event the following day. That wasn't sufficient. The damage was more profound. And I think that is the issue for the Biden folks. They didn't take it seriously enough, fast enough, and that's why they're still digging out of this hole 10 days later.
There's a brief period when there's a serious talk about whether or not to get Biden off the ticket. I don't see, unless he goes voluntarily, I don't see any way to do it.
I agree. I think the only way at this point, Speaker, is if he has some kind of an undiagnosed health issue that we don't know about that emerges. And I think that would give the congressional Democrats cover to try to force him out. I think absent that, I think he's sticking. And I think he's sticking for one straightforward reason. I wrote about it in my column earlier this week. Biden has convinced himself that the rank and file of his party is just fine with him remaining as their nominee, and that the effort to dump him is from the so-called elites of the party who never liked him in the first place. He's trying to rerun the 2020 Democratic primary effectively at warp speed here in the summer of 24 by saying, the wise guys, the establishment, the insiders don't like me, never have, don't take me seriously. The people are with me. Now, you and I know it's more complicated than that. The polling shows that plenty of rank-and-file Democrats want to dump him, but that's been his frame to survive. That's been his sort of battle plan, and it's working so far in part because members of Congress don't have the courage of their convictions to speak out what they actually believe about him because they don't want to get crosswise with some of their voters.
Their current plan is to actually have a virtual vote because of the Ohio law, which is sort of a blessing to Biden. The Ohio law requires naming the candidates before the Democratic convention.
And this is actually an important point that you'll appreciate being an historian and a practitioner of politics. The Democrats historically were the insurgent party. They were the disorderly party. They're the top-down party now. They are so hierarchical. They are command and control. They don't like messes. They don't like disorder. They want to be surgical about this. So to your point, there's not going to be a sort of floor fight or some kind of a stampede at the convention. Democrats want to beat Donald Trump first, second, and third. They don't want disorder on their side. And I think that helps Biden, that compulsion toward order to fend off Trump. And that's been the order of the day for Democrats for almost a decade now. Stave off dissent. Don't talk about our private business in public. Focus on Trump. And I think that is really aiding Biden at this stage of the game because he knows the alternative to him is chaos. And his party doesn't want chaos.
If you were a serious Democrat, you were desperate to win, you concluded that Biden couldn't win, I don't see how you get past Kamala.
Well, that's the other issue, that a lot of Democrats in 2023 in elected office were uneasy about Biden running as their nominee, but they didn't want to engage the next question, which always was, okay, well, if you're not for Biden, are you for the vice president? And of course, they didn't want to litigate that issue. And that's why I think there was no real effort to speak out against Biden in 2023. Right. I'm with you. If it's not Biden, I'm skeptical that Biden will drop out, but for some reason it's not Biden, I'm almost certain it would be Kamala Harris as the alternative. And that raises the question of, would she be better than a wounded Biden this fall?
She's actually more vulnerable than Biden. She has a much narrower base of acceptability.
There are Democrats who are working on campaigns who believe the same thing, that in some ways, Democratic Senate, gubernatorial, and House candidates would be better off with a wounded Biden because the Democratic Party and their candidates below the top of the ticket could go straight to the messaging of Tammy Baldwin or whoever else, Bob Casey, will be a check on Donald Trump, right? You know, you've been in enough campaigns, Speaker, including 1996, to know when you're losing the top of the ticket, a lot of candidates down ballot change their message in the fall to say, I'll be a check on so-and-so. And I think that's what you would see with a wounded Biden. It's more complicated with Kamala Harris.
I wrote a book called March the Majority and described the 16-year project to trying to create a majority for the first time in 40 years. We found that as long as we had a Republican president, it was really hard for that reason. Because people said, wait a second, this could be a big issue this fall. If it becomes clear that Biden both is the nominee and can't win, then creating a sense of balance in the Congress, I think, becomes a surprisingly real threat to Republicans.
Absolutely. And by the way, you don't have to go back to 96. There's a more recent example of this. It wasn't as explicit in terms of being a check on Biden. But 2020 was a pretty darn good year for the Republican Party. I mean, obviously, Trump lost on the top of the ticket because in 3 states he had a 70,000 vote deficit. But you look at people like Susan Collins in 2020, she won. She was successful. So there's certainly a scenario where you could see Democratic senators hanging on in 24, even while Biden loses.
Let me ask one question, which is, I think, unusually troubling and sensitive, and that is the whole speculation that Biden has Parkinson's disease. It's been reported that a doctor who specializes in Parkinson's visited the White House 8 times in 8 months. Do you have any sense of this from the people you talk to?
What they have said, the White House, is that he got looked at by a neurologist as part of his annual physical checkup, and that there's nothing beyond that. But as you know, there's a long history of presidents who had undisclosed health issues for centuries. That's been going on in American politics, right? So we don't know what we don't know there. I will say this, from a straight political standpoint, I think that is the only way that Biden could be removed from the ticket. I'm with you. I think Biden is going to be the nominee. But if there is some undisclosed or revealed health issue, I think that would be the way that he is taken off the ticket.
As you talk to people and look at all this stuff, and you got a remarkable sense of the whole nation, which is why you're one of the best reporters in the business. How much do you think the debate actually hurt Biden, and how much it was just a glancing blow rather than a definitive problem?
Well, if you put it in terms of Vegas, the odds, he was probably going into the debate, he probably had a 40-60 chance to win the election. And I think that the debate lowered that, right? He was already the underdog, and I think the debate just made him more of an underdog speaker. I think he still is in the game. I think that American politics in this era is about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, it's his to lose, as the saying goes, and he may do just that. I mean, I do think that Trump has been more disciplined this time around, but obviously he's got a track record of saying things that are outlandish and provocative, and he certainly could give away the election. But I think right now that is the only thing Democrats have going for them, is their entire bet is that Trump will blow himself up sometime this fall and the country will default to Biden. That's not great odds if you're a Democrat, but I think that's where this election is now. Democrats depending entirely on Trump creating some kind of a massive misstep or mistake.
Have you been surprised how disciplined Trump has been for the last 10 days?
I have. Besides that one moment where he was, on the golf cart and was caught by a phone camera, he's been remarkably disciplined. But if you talk to any Republican, they will tell you privately the best chance Trump has to win is the less he says, the less he does. Look, if he stayed at Mar-a-Lago playing 18 holes every day and didn't speak between now and Election Day, I think he'd win 400 electoral votes.
I mean, it is funny that even with the debate, there seems to be almost a ceiling that Trump has not penetrated.
Yeah, we agree on that. Look, Trump is such a defined political product in America. There's so few voters that are uncertain where they stand on Trump. A friend of mine likened it almost to the Civil War and how the Civil War defined American politics afterward. Everything was shaped by which side were you on, the North or the South. And I think that that's Trump in this era. People know where they are on Trump. And I think that helps him because his floor is so damn solid, but it hurts him because he does have a ceiling. And, he's never going to be a majoritarian figure of this country. He can win, but he's never going to be a 53% candidate. Never.
It'll be interesting to watch because I think there's a very different question than the one people are currently focusing on. I mean, currently, people are really saying, can Biden win? I think the deeper question is, do you really believe he could be president for the next 4 years?
And I think that gets to the heart of the most profound problem Democrats have on their hands for the next 4 months is, how do they look in the camera, governor, senator, congressman, and say that Joe Biden can serve for 4 more years? I think it's a really difficult case to make to the voter that this person can serve in this capacity for 4 more years. I think it's one thing to say that he's the better candidate than Trump or that Trump is unfit for office. I think it's harder for them to say, yes, America, this man can serve till he's 86.
Well, and at the same time, that means that the role of Kamala becomes much bigger. Because in a sense, you can make the argument, if you vote for Biden, you're actually voting in all probability for Kamala to become president.
And that was always the subtext of this election. I think what happens now is that it's the actual text. I mean, I think you're going to see that Republicans make that case directly in a much more overt way. And it's Trump, so he doesn't really do subtle in the first place. So Trump will just say it out loud.
I don't think I've ever seen him be particularly subtle.
No. He reads those stage directions out loud, doesn't he? Yeah.
That's because he's New York Post. He's not New York Times.
You got it. You got it.
I think he learned that style while he was a businessman.
You don't have to wait until the 17th paragraph with Donald Trump. You get it in the lead.
Yeah, or on page 1.
Exactly, in the wood, exactly. The screaming headline, exactly, right.
Were you surprised by the Supreme Court ruling on immunity?
I was, yeah. I thought they would dismiss it and avoid the hot potato altogether. How about you?
I thought they walked through pretty carefully. I listened to the oral arguments, about half of them, and you could tell that they, in a funny kind of way, the New York trial moved them because it suddenly was an indication that, even though that was a state-level trial, that Bragg represented the potential for political prosecutors to go after presidents after they left office in a way that would take apart the whole system and would mean that any president would be permanently at risk. And you could hear that in their questions, including from some of the more moderate of the conservatives. So in that sense, I was surprised. Andy McCarthy and others are now making the argument that, in fact, it clearly eliminates the case in New York because it was based on his official acts.
That's the question, right? And you saw that judge push back sentencing in New York for the same reason. So, I mean, this could have a second-order effect on that case, too.
Part of the response on the left is sort of the way we used to respond to the Warren Court, and that you have people vowing to file articles of impeachment, et cetera. Doesn't that only just become noise?
Yeah, I don't think it matters as much politically. People's minds are not going to be changed about Donald Trump because of this case. Look, I think part of the reason, Speaker, why the Biden White House called for a June debate is because the trial was not breaking through in American culture. This trial was a non-factor for much of the time it was going on, and the Biden folks knew they had to change the trajectory of the race, and because the trial wasn't cutting any ice. And so they called for this debate, and they put all their chips on the table in this debate, and obviously it backfired. But I think you can trace this debate happening in June, unprecedented to have a June debate, in part because the Biden folks realized this trial is not moving the needle politically.
Well, of course, it's also to some extent unprecedented to have two candidates so early lock up their nomination and have both of them having been president.
I'm trying to think of when there was such little primary competition with a non-incumbent president.
Well, George W. Bush.
99, 2000. But Bush lost New Hampshire. He lost Michigan, right?
Yep. In that sense, Trump's dominance and Biden's, although Biden as an incumbent was in relatively better shape, given everything that happened to Trump, the fact that he could come back, build the machine he has built, and so decisively win the nomination is pretty astonishing.
He's a pop culture figure. It's bigger than politics. He's a cultural phenomenon whose grip on the voter, his base, is bigger than American politics. I mean, I realized this when it occurred to me that the Trump lawn sign or the Trump 4x8 sign was not going to be taken down after the election. Historically in this country, as you know, we put the lawn signs out in the fall and they're on the median or somebody's front yard. And then, we have Halloween and it's election day and then it's Thanksgiving and the signs come in, right? Trump's signs never came back in. And that to me told me everything.
I was astonished. Calista and I went back to her alma mater, Luther College.
In Decorah, Iowa. Yes, sir.
There you go. This is proof to our audience that you do know America.
Maeve's Pizza, which I know you've been to before.
Yeah, Calista used to rent the apartment above Maeve's. I mean, St. August to be a small world.
Exactly.
She was being honored for her lifetime achievements. And we were walking down Main Street, and there's a store. Now, this is 8-9 months ago. There's a store that is Trump. It's not the campaign. It's not organized. It's local people who have been running this store, filled up with Trump material. I try to tell reporters, you cannot think of him as a candidate. He is the champion of a national movement, which is why when he gets attacked by the left, he gets bigger. Because the left is attacking our champion. He's not attacking some candidate. It's a really gigantic and I think very much underappreciated reality.
Yeah, I mean, as big as Reagan was on the right, and even as big as Obama was with a lot of Democrats, there was not this sort of perpetual sustained movement with him, right? With either of them. I was in Red Lodge, Montana over July 4th. Same thing on Main Street. There's a Trump store with Trump paraphernalia. You just wouldn't see that, right, with previous presidents. He's a bigger figure than that, which I think helps him, and it helped ensure his nomination. But the double edge to that sword is that he's a cultural figure in a way that alienates a lot of the country, too.
I think you almost have to go back to Andrew Jackson to get the level of passion that is inspired and the level of divisiveness.
I think FDR almost gets you there, right? People hated FDR in ways that folks don't understand nowadays, because in the history of the country, FDR was this incredible leader in the wheelchair with Follow the Dog. FDR was detested by, a third of the country.
That's a fair commentary. I think people really loved and rallied to FDR. I mean, the other person, of course, who was deeply divisive was Lincoln.
He was a wartime figure, too, which helped, right? I mean, FDR became less divisive after the war, right?
But I was going to say, I mean, Lincoln is the other person when you realize that I think there were 10 states that would not put him on the ballot. It was a genuine knockdown, drag-out fight.
These figures in the present have been transformed into almost Disney-like characters. But, in real time, flesh and blood, American politics, they were deeply polarizing and divisive.
I'm curious, have you had a chance to look at the new Republican Party platform?
I have, and it reminded me a lot of Donald Trump's tweets, and because you could tell it came from Trump. It's interesting. Trump is one of those politicians where when the words on the screen came from him versus somebody else, and you can really tell a lot of it's from him.
I was very close to the people who were putting it together, and it really was Donald Trump's platform. And he made no bones about it.
I'm almost to the point where they may as well have had it like in a black Sharpie that he wrote with his own hand. I mean, it was so vividly Trump, the language, the presentation of it. It was pure Trump. New York Post, as you would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, that was that was by design. And very early on, Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, the two top people, sent out a memo that's quite detailed that says it will be shorter. It will be clear for the average American. They sort of outline. And then I think the last platform in 2016 was 37,000 words. And I think this one's 4,600.
It tells you everything you need to know. And also, just from a content standpoint, it reflects what Trump's politics. And now, Trump doesn't have a lot of deep-seated ideological views, but he does have some instincts, and obviously this reflects that. He's not a sort of cultural traditionalist or cultural warrior by any means, but does feel strongly about issues relating to trade and immigration. And I think this reflects that.
Yeah. We run a project called the America's New Majority Project. People can go see it at americasnewmajorityproject.com. Since 2018, we've done well over 37,000 interviews. And if you were to track where the American people are and lay it over this platform, it is remarkably close. I think Trump uses his rallies as focus groups.
Absolutely. And you lived this in 2012 and you watched it closely in 2008. there was a marketplace for what I would call kind of fiscal traditionalism, almost liberalism, and a harder line on the border. Don't touch entitlements. Let's crack down on countries that are cheating on us with their goods. Huckabee did a little bit of that in 08. Santorum did some of that in 12. And this is where Trump has really taken the party. And to your point, with the general electorate, there is an appetite for what you could call economic moderation or even liberalism, with a hard line on immigration, a hard line on trade. Buchanan did some of this in 92. There's always been a market for this, and it's a market with working class voters, white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian.
Are you surprised by how much the two-party coalitions are swapping?
Yes. I think it's the great story of our time. I think it's the most important political trend of this era, which is the great realignment. Upscale voters are obviously much more inclined to support Democrats now, mostly on culture and identity, and the same thing for working class voters. Here's where I'm fascinated, though. At what point do we see the changing coalitions reflected in the policies? Okay, because let's take, for example, in the Senate, which is still kind of more reflective of the older GOP. After the train derailment in Ohio, you had this coalition of Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley, who wanted to crack down on the railroads and really regulate them. And the challenge is that there's an appetite for that among Democrats, but they couldn't get other Republicans. At what point do Republicans reflect their coalition when it comes to labor and economics? And at what point do Democrats reflect their coalition when it comes to economics? I think that's the big question.
The underlying movement of the voters is preceding the movement of the politicians.
Absolutely, especially in the Senate, which, as we know, moves slowly generally.
But that's sort of what the Founding Fathers wanted. I say this with some bias since I was Speaker of the House. The Founding Fathers intended for the Senate to be sort of a sea anchor, slowing down patterns and trends, and they expected the House to always overreact.
It'll be fascinating to see if the House does ever move any legislation. If you had a Republican majority in the House and Senate and a Republican president, would the House ever move anything that's more congenial to labor? We're still a ways off from that, but I think that'll be the great test.
Let me ask you one last thing, which is about your profession. To what extent does it bother you that the coverage of Biden had been shaded in such a way that the debate was a great shock?
Well, I can speak for myself and tell you that in 2023, I wrote multiple columns about the challenge of Biden's age. And I was the first person to write the news that Dean Phillips was thinking about running for president because nobody else was doing it, and that Biden wouldn't address his age. And I can tell you, when I did that, I had a lot of conversations with Democratic lawmakers who said, yeah, you're right, this is a problem. But it was a collective action issue. No Democratic governor, senator, or House member wanted to be the person to raise their hand first and say, Mr. President, thanks for your service. We honor you. I hope you and Jill will take this gold watch and have fun in Rehoboth and enjoy the grandkids. None of them wanted to be the first, and they all wanted the other guy to do it. And we're seeing the same problem now, frankly. Nobody wants to say it out loud like that. And I think that was the issue. The sentiment was there, but nobody would put their name on it. And so nobody ever spoke out. And I think we're seeing the same challenge now. But I have a question for you, though, because you lived through 1996 and you know what it's like when your candidates are running and the top of the ticket is destined to lose or at least struggle to win. Do you think in this polarized era that we're in, a much more polarized, calcified moment than 96, do you think that ticket splitting could make any kind of a resurgence if Biden is on top of the ticket? Could Democratic senators survive and get folks to ticket split because it's so obvious that Trump's going to win?
I think this could be like 1972 when Nixon crushed McGovern because McGovern just totally collapsed. But the Democrats actually did pretty well in the congressional races. And I think it goes back to your point, which is if the Democrats say, Trump's probably going to win, and therefore you need me to be a balance against Trump, that means that they have sort of abandoned their candidate. And we faced that problem in 96 because We had a welfare reform bill that was very, very popular, and we had kept Medicaid reform on it, and so Clinton had used that as the excuse to veto it. And we were faced with the question of whether to pass just a clean welfare reform bill. And the Dole people were desperate for us not to do it because they thought it was their most effective weapon to potentially beat Clinton. We had a conference for a couple of hours, and our members said, look, we have not been reelected since 1928. The first majority in 40 years, but the first to be reelected in 68 years. And they said, if we don't pass this, we will not be reelected as a majority. I had the duty of calling Dole's campaign manager and saying, we're going to move the bill.
How'd that go?
He was very sad.
I bet it was.
He was not having an argument, he was having a report. You may see a point this August, September, particularly if Biden gets worse, where the Democratic battle cry becomes, help us balance off the Trump presidency.
And the only question is, who's the first one to do it? Is it John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio? Who will be the first one to run that ad saying?
Well, Tester probably needs it more than anybody else because Trump's margin in Montana is going to be horrifying.
And you can see it now. I'll stand up to President Trump when he deserves it, and I'll work with him when he's good for Montana. You can see the script now, right? It writes itself. What a year for politics and what a year for historians.
I want to thank you for joining me. I knew, given everything I've read that you'd work on, that you'd be fascinating. You are. Our listeners can actually read your reporting at Politico.com. Your book, This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future, about the 2020 election, is a fascinating read and useful in looking at what's happening now. And it's available at Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. Jonathan, anytime you want to join me and have a chat like this, I'd be honored. You were one of the great students of American politics, and it's great that you would share with us.
Thanks for having me, Speaker, and thanks again for the book plug. And the title is This Will Not Pass, which 3 years later holds up pretty darn well, I'll say.
It does. It's great.
Thanks, Speaker. See you in Milwaukee.
Thank you to my guest, Jonathan Martin. You can get a link to read his column in Politico on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.